All right, we're back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, those who bounce in between. We're popping gin like there's no tomorrow, and we are watching this guy, this guy, Re-Education. He's an anarchist YouTuber who I've criticized in the past constructively. I consider him not an enemy, not in the same way as like somebody like Valsh or somebody like Pac-Man, some other fool. But I consider this guy sort of almost like a wayward sheep, and I want to I want to shepherd him back. He's going down a weird road here with the anarchisms, and Grandpa Dankey wants to bring him back home.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Aaron, and this is my show, Re-Education. And today I'm going to talk just briefly about the Vanguard Party. Now, a lot of Marxist-Leninists and MLMs are probably just about to scream at this moment, but I'm going to tell you that the Vanguard Party was a horrible idea, and it would never work, and it has led to the fall of the Soviet Union. So holding on to this idea is foolish. Now let me explain why. At the very beginning of the formation of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of discussion about how they should go about achieving the revolution. The revolution being worker control of the means of production. If you're not a communist or socialist, or leftist in general, these are probably brand new concepts to you, and I'll introduce them by saying,
eating the
for
fuck out
sake
of
of
these
argument, let's consider that the Soviet Union wasn't a good or bad thing, but a neutral thing, and we're only specifically talking about the processes in which we used to create the Soviet Union. You have to remember that this is around 1917 to 1920s. There was no Soviet...
Okay, so he's I mean, the Vanguard Party was being built since, like, what was it? Like, since, like, 1898 or something like that? I mean...
Yeah, I think there was a previous failed revolution in Russia.
Yeah, and, like, that was the whole thing. Like, why they were working with the Menshevik Party and all that. They were working to, like, build this Vanguard. I mean, like, sure, the Mensheviks didn't agree, but that was, like, what the Bolsheviks wanted to create for Russia. And, so no, the Vanguard Party wasn't decided on like after 1917. It was ready to go, and that was like why it was successful. Is because it was preparing like this whole time. It was the most advanced party, more than like the provisional government or anything else. So that's why they were able to come in so swiftly and essentially, take hold of it.
Union to speak of yet. It was all just a figment of their imagination. So the ways in which we could go about achieving such a thing were wide open. The territory was a broad field of ideas. And one of those ideas was to create something called a Vanguard Party. The idea of a Vanguard Party is basically a small elite group of Marxist-Leninists who are able to go around convincing the agrarian population to side with their idea of socialism. And once they have sided with their idea of socialism, they would basically erect the Soviets, which is what their group was called, the Soviets as the leadership of the proletariat, as basically a group of...
Just go back. Let me, I was paying attention, but I just want to see what's going on here.
Socialism. Yeah. They would basically erect the Soviets, which is what their group was called, the Soviets as the leadership of the proletariat, as basically a group of proletariat.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he meant to say the Bolsheviks wanted to empower the Soviets, which was like workers' factory councils, agrarian councils, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, the Soviets were, erected a long time before the revolution.
Yeah,
and they were used to, have workers. They were nothing more than just a place for workers to like voice their complaints and stuff like that. But that's what they were essentially there for. And like after the revolution, it was these Soviets that were like, the municipal like councils and everything for like that town, like, or that city.
Yeah, I feel like this is a good time to bring out that definition. Frederick Engels and Karl Marx presented the concept of the Vanguard Party as solely qualified politically to lead the proletariat in a revolution. So in chapter 2 of Proletarians and Communists, the Communist Manifesto, they said this: the communists, therefore, are on one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the lines of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communist is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois democracy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. So that is sort of what Marx and Engels were talking about when they were suggesting the Vanguard Party as the way to go about having a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Being elevated to the position of leadership, which in those days was looked at by anarchists as being nothing more than, well, basically what it is: a transfer of power from one elite group to another. That's all it was. And that is all it is. Basically, when you transfer the power from one elite group to another, all you're doing is creating a situation where the king has died. Long live the king. Where
Alright, so this part, I really wanted to talk about how he used the word elite, sort of very misleadingly. He seems to equate the elite in a capitalist society, like the bourgeoisie, the 1% billionaires, with the party elites of a vanguard party. And he says that, when the workers seize state power, the vanguard party becomes the new societal elite, much the same way that in our society the bourgeois are the elite. And so it's very misleading, because a party elite, a vanguard party elite, a member, you could also say, is somebody who is also a proletariat. So their class interests don't change just because they're a member of the party. If anything, they have even stronger class interests. They have even stronger proletarian class consciousness than your average Joe.
Yeah, and as far as I forgot what I was gonna fucking say.
That's all right. That happens to me. That happens to me all the time.
Or basically, the monarch had been removed to be replaced by another monarch, and that doesn't create socialism. So when you create a
in short, to equate the Vanguard Party with the capitalist social elite is very misleading, and it shows that he doesn't really understand what the role in the constituency of the Vanguard Party is. I mean, they're not made up of a bunch of sycophants that want to get rid of all of their class interest and all of their revolutionary interest after getting a little modicum of power. You read Lenin, and he talks about deglamorizing power, deglamorizing the role of being a boss or being in charge, being a statesman, and making it so where your average person can participate in that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And especially if you think of Russia at the time, I mean, there was a lot of things that they had to get rid of, within the state, the church, they had to get it out of the government and everything. But yeah, that is something that Lenin talks about a lot. I remember just talking about having to essentially restructure the government. You do have a state, but the goal is to smash it first,
Mm-hmm.
and then build up one that is more in line with a proletarian dictatorship.
Yeah, it's a two-step process. Step one, you smash the state, and step two, you build a proletarian state in its place. And the anarchists want to stop at step one. And they say, we're all good here, dog.
Yeah, and that was actually a complaint of Lenin's in the in State and Revolution, where he says that the Mensheviks and the Social Democrat types, when they had the provisional government, they were essentially just taking over like these positions that were just created, under the czar. So yeah, if you did that, you would be a terrible proletarian dictatorship. There
Yeah.
has to be a restructuring, otherwise you're just filling like, I don't know, these positions that were built for people with totally like different class interests. You wouldn't really want those to be a lot of these like positions to be there afterwards. I mean, depending on your situation, but that example I used was like the church. They knew that they had to get that out.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like if there was a communist revolution in the United States, they would continue to let Congress, the Supreme Court, and the office of the president exist. Those institutions, those old institutions of bourgeois power, would be broken down and replaced by new institutions of workers' power. So it's not like the social roles of oppression just transfer to a new group of small elites under the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah, and I think like the big burden of proof is like, on their side to be like, where were these Soviet officials just like, just reaping profits from all these people and stuff like this? I mean, you hear things like, oh, Stalin had like all these cars and shit like that. And it's like, I mean, yeah, they did make more money and stuff like that. They probably, I mean, they had like access to more things, but it wasn't like they were just living like high off their ass or anything like that, especially considering like, how we live in like today's time.
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, I mean, was it really this system of them like, oh, we're going to fight for communism, but somehow just enrich ourselves the whole time? Like, I don't know, like the burden of proof is on your side to like show where they did that.
And plus, even if Stalin was some kind of Scrooge McDuck fat cat who had like a pile of gold coins that he dived into like every day, and drove around like in a solid platinum Rolls Royce, like it wouldn't change the fact that the entire structure of the dictatorship of the proletariat elevated your average common worker, your average person, to a much better standard of living. It gave them a much more active role in the decisions of government than they ever would have had under the czarist regime or any capitalist regime. It liberated women, it liberated ethnic and cultural minorities, it secured universal suffrage and rights for all people except for capitalists. So if you want to call that system authoritarian because they were mean to capitalists, boo hoo. I don't really care. Cry me a river. Capitalists exploit everybody else every single day, and nobody cries for the exploited masses. But God forbid some workers decide to rise up and they take a rich dude's mansion away, and we're supposed to sing a sad song for him. Doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I guess I wonder, like, if you had this like anarchist revolution, this anarcho-communist revolution, like, what institutions would you have to start forming? I mean, there would have to be something. I mean, I'm not sure what he believes exactly, but I mean, you're gonna have to like coordinate, military equipment, stuff like that. So like, you're gonna have to have a line between the normal population and some other sector who's like dedicated their time day to day to like, do these other like governmental tasks. I mean, even if you don't call them governmental, but these like things that essentially like help your society protect itself or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, you're just gonna have to rephrase all these things, but like if you were successful, you would essentially have like what would look like a Soviet state, where you have like councils with workers, and you know what I mean, like
Yeah.
that would be. It's just a rephrasing of how that's done.
Yeah, and so that's really what we're trying to drive home, is that you can call it a potato, you can call it a potato, it's the same fucking thing. Like, what the kind of system you want to build, whether you call it a dictatorship of the proletariat or you call it an anarchist confederation, it's the same thing. It's the dictatorship of the proletariat, but it's just a much shittier one. It's just a much more decentralized and uncoordinated one that probably wouldn't last very long under the conditions of imperialism. But that's where we get our gripes from. That's where we sort of say, hey, I don't think you anarchist types have really thought this whole thing through. You may be on the same page when it comes to smashing the state, but when it comes to what to do after that, it's just pie in the sky. It's just nothing but idealism.
Totalitarian dictatorship of the proletariat, by which you are specifically referring to as the Vanguard Party, the elite.
All right, let's back it up just a tad.
Socialism. So when you create a totalitarian dictatorship of the proletariat, by which you are specifically referring to as the Vanguard Party, the elite group of Marxist-Leninists that were able to convince the rest of the population to vote their party in, or to basically raise their party up. When you're talking about that, you're talking about a system that inherently breeds not communism, but state capitalism.
All right, so
I think he's missing bureaucracy with like state capitalism.
Yeah. Let's read his definition. It says state capitalism is an economic system in which the state undertakes commercial economic activity and where the means of production are organized and managed as state-owned business enterprises. He doesn't... It just cuts off there. Or ... It's great.
Yeah, I mean, like, it goes on. You know what I mean?
Could have thrown up the rest of the definition there. It might have helped a little bit.
And it doesn't even necessarily imply like that all the industries are state owned. You know what I mean? Like, state capitalism, more implies that there is a private market, but the state has like a big say so in a lot of what they're doing, and they have command over that. But yeah, to deny like the USSR as being like socialist, I mean that's essentially what he's like trying to do. It wasn't socialist, it was state capitalist. You can't really say, I mean, that there wasn't any private market that they were commanding or anything like that. It was all like owned by the state.
Yeah, and I mean you can talk about like the new economic policy during I think it was the early 20s, and it had small scale state capitalism, but it was state capitalism under the control of the Communist Party. They weren't just going to let like capitalists come in and run freer range, and they basically brought them in only insofar as they could like strengthen and boost the local economy just enough to jumpstart socialism.
Yeah, I think he's getting like bureaucracy confused with like state capitalism. I mean, it's fair to assume that, like, bureaucracy is going to be a problem. And that's something, like, the USSR dealt with. And there are criticisms to be made about, like, they could have handled it better in certain areas. I mean, whenever you have how people normally break it down is, like, if you have, you still have a state, right? When you're having this dictatorship of the proletariat. You're going to have like those coercive institutions like the police and stuff like that, unfortunately. But because what was I going to say? But yeah, in order to have that though, you're going to have to be able to pay these people like a little more, or give them certain other benefits or something like that. So it's something you have to work around. It's something you can't let run rampant. But if you look at the USSR, I mean, as far as like how they were paid according to like officials versus like just the average worker, I mean, like it was very, it's just like crazy compared to like what we look at today. Yeah. As far as like what politicians make versus like the average worker. But yeah, I mean, bureaucracy is something that has it kind of took over after Stalin and all that. It was like the bureaucratic side of the party that grew too large was able to thwart the revolution. So I think it's something we shouldn't like scuff at and just think it's not like gonna be an issue, but it is something to like fight against.
Yeah, and I think even in an anarchist society you would still have some kind of bureaucracy form, some kind of representative institutions form, and a certain amount of corruption. So I imagine in whether you're dealing with a socialist society or an anarchist society, you would still have to deal with, bureaucracy and corruption. But yeah, as far as calling Marxist Leninism state capitalism, I don't think that's a fitting statement at all, because of course capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production. State capitalism would just be that, uh, geared and catered towards the needs of the state, but you would still have private capitalists controlling the company. It would almost be like if the United States had direct say over what Amazon does, but Amazon is still led by Jeff Bezos. Um, like if the United States could dictate what Tesla does, what they produce, in order to suit the American economy and U.S. interest, but Elon Musk was still the CEO of Tesla.
Yeah, or like the Schindler's List example.
Yeah.
Like he was his own private. He owned that business and everything, but was pretty much told by the Nazis like what to build and stuff like that. That's an example of like state capitalism, like how it functions.
So I mean, in the USSR, outside of the new economic policy, which was brief, and it certainly wasn't a long lasting policy, and it certainly wasn't a wide scale policy, but uh, under the USSR, you didn't have private capitalists owning businesses, reaping profit from the surplus value of generated by the workers. You just didn't have that. So to call that state capitalism is completely misleading.
State capitalism doesn't go away. It just perpetuates more state capitalism. The idea in Marxism-Leninism is that eventually, once you create a socialist state, that things like money and hierarchies would just wither away and disappear. But clearly, that isn't what happened, or whatever could happen, because when you create a dictatorship, all you've done is create a dictatorship. You haven't created anything else. And you even see that with China today. China today didn't turn into a communist country. China today...
Okay, so I mean, I think he sees the term dictatorship of the proletariat and he cringes. Like a lot of people who haven't read theory, they see that term and they cringe. They're like, ooh, Marx wants a dictatorship. He's authoritarian. But the term dictatorship of the proletariat isn't the same as like a dictatorship of an evil tyrant. It's the dictatorship of the working class over society. It's a good thing. You should want that.
Yeah, and like in order to like think of a communist society as like a dictatorship in this way, I mean, you're thinking of like how Marx defined it. Yeah, he called it a dictatorship of the proletariat, but we talked about it earlier. I mean, it's being honest about what a state is. It can't be anything but a dictatorship of somebody. And on the other hand, you'd have to buy into like what pretty much Western propaganda has just been saying about these these socialist states, that they're dictatorships. So I mean, there's kind of a double meaning of the word like going on there, and you can't like equate both of those like together like just like quickly like that.
Yeah, and I already know what anarchists are gonna say. It's like, well, we don't want a state. We don't want the workers to have state power. We want them to smash the state. But any kind of institution that you build to suppress capitalism is going to take the function of a state. You can call it whatever you want. Like I said, you can call it a potato, you can call it a potato, but it's still the same thing. You can call it a loosely coordinated anarchist confederation, but it in function is a state.
Went from a state capitalist country to a regular capitalist country. It's capitalism classic. And their economy
Hold
is
on.
not... And you even see that...
To say, I mean, I don't know if this is the time to go into it, but like to say China is just like regular capitalism, like it's the embodiment of laissez-faire capitalism, is just like totally off. I mean...
Yeah.
If anything, China is a good example of something that is like state capitalist.
Yeah.
In a large section of their economy, at least.
Yeah, exactly. Like you take a company like Huawei, which is a privately owned corporation, but it's entire corporate structure is sort of commanded by the Chinese government,
Mm-hmm.
or at least encouraged to function on behalf of the Chinese government. So it's China is much more close to what I think re-education is talking about as a state capitalist country, but it's far from a typical Marxist-Leninist idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah, and to say like bureaucracy and socialism would just always lead to like capitalism is like not true. I mean, yeah, sure, the USSR fell, but it wasn't because of like bureaucracy in the party. Yeah, it contributed to it, but there was also like terrible decisions made by the party that like brought that on. You can't just say, oh, these hierarchies will just bring capitalism back because they're just bad, you know.
Yeah, like anarchist whole thing is like we want to get rid of unjustified hierarchies, but our whole thing as Marxist is that the dictatorship of the proletariat is absolutely a justified hierarchy. But when we say that, you guys reject it. You say no, it's authoritarian, it's totalitarian, it's an evil dictatorship, and we don't want that. So, you know, ultimately it comes down to like, do you want the working class to succeed in the revolution or not? And it seems like anarchists want to sort of play the role of being a revolutionary, but they don't want to play the role of trying to keep that revolution, trying to consolidate that revolution. They just want to have a little adventure. And, I'm not accusing a re education of being this way, but I'm just saying, like, that's how it sort of comes across. You don't have, like, a concrete plan for how to deal with the aftermath of a revolution.
Yeah, I mean, like, what would keep these like major industries together? I mean, like, yeah, if the workers like seize power of all of them, I mean that's cool, but that's just like a just having like a bunch of like co-ops and stuff like that, and I mean that's still like a market. It's gonna be subject to like market forces. If you have these different like owned factories like competing against each other versus having them like on a national plan. You know what I mean? So you're gonna, if anything, you'll see elements of capitalism sprouting up like probably right off the bat with these factories having to compete with each other.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing to say that they will all lock hands and sing kumbaya. It could devolve into a struggle of dominance, and without some kind of a central governing authority to, reel them in, you'll wind up, factionalizing and splitting off, which is exactly what, happens.
Yeah, because it's like, I mean, if the conditions were perfect and nothing was really going on, I mean, yeah, you might be able to like, all just make things in these separate factories.
Yeah.
But when you have like different parts of the population advocating for different things, minority groups and stuff like this, you're gonna, have a party that's gonna have to like really think about what is the best way for us to go. You know what I mean? And to just be like, to just leave it up to the whims of every person, it's just it's almost self-destructive.
Yeah, it's kind of like when he talks about, well, I mean, later on he's going to talk about the mass line, and when he gets to that, we'll talk a little bit more, but he doesn't really understand the mass line is something that is guided by the Vanguard Party. If you are trying to wait until you have like 100% support from the entire proletariat, like your movement will never get off the ground, because obviously the proletariat is divided. Even in our own country, you can see conservatives, liberals, leftists, all those different people. They're very divided, and contrary to what re-education says, you're never going to have an anarchist revolution by reaching out to proletariats left, right, and center. But trying to cater to conservatives and centrists will, if anything, it will lead to a decline in the goals of your movement.
Yeah, and I know like in some of his other videos he talks about the mass line as far as that being like the way to keep this society like together.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, like how Mao described it, I mean that's what it is. I mean that was like Mao's term for the mass, for keeping in touch with the masses.
Yeah.
But I think you pointed this out, but like the term itself implies that there's like a vanguard party connected to the masses. That like that's the mass line. It's not a spontaneous line that develops like amongst just everybody and they just hold it up, you know. So it's not even like really using like what Mao thought of the mass line as.
That was China today. China today didn't turn into a communist country. China today went from a state capitalist country to a regular capitalist country. It's capitalism classic.
So yeah, according to him, like China under Mao was like just normal, or was state capitalism.
Yeah.
Now it's just totally normal, just like USA capitalism.
There's no difference between China and America.
Yeah, same thing.
And their economy is not doing well because of it. It just seen the largest crash that it's ever seen in the past, I think, 70 years? That isn't to say...
I mean, yeah, it has like experienced like a little setback. I think it's actually recovered now, if I'm not wrong. But like, it was funny. There was a crash that happened in like 2015 or 16.
Oh yeah.
And like everybody was like, "Oh, this is the end of China. They're having their big economic crash," but they just recovered like it was nothing. It wasn't like devastating like our 2008 crash or anything like that.
Yeah.
Now when there's all these like Western, you know, like Financial Times, Washington Post, and all that stuff, they keep putting out these articles saying like China's like failing, like their economy, and it's just a matter of time before they just implode. But I mean, like, if you look at it, yeah, their rate of growth has slightly dropped, but their rate of growth is like 7%, and ours is only like 2 or 3 or something like that. So, yeah, they're not collapsing. They're still actually like way ahead of us.
They're like somebody who's almost finished the marathon. We're like still, you know, almost halfway through, and we're like, fuck it, they're gonna fail.
They're getting tired now.
Yeah, they're gonna tucker out anytime soon. Their calf is gonna blow out, and we're gonna win this thing. Yeah, let's see what else he has to say.
That every part of Marxism-Leninism is incorrect. It's not. But the idea of a Vanguard party is a horrible, horrible idea. When you create a situation where your ideals are tied to a man, your ideals will die with that man if he dies. But if you create a system where your ideals are standing on their own, they can never
Hold on. Yeah, I mean, like, it's almost like he's thinking that, that like we, like Leninism advocated for a cult of personality around Stalin. Like that's like something they wrote about, like, oh, well, you know, when you're building your revolution, make sure you have a figure that you, like, you know, just worship like a god.
Yeah.
That was never a part of it. I mean, that was a symptom. There was people who felt that way, like Stalin was a god, and stuff like that. I mean, not true, obviously, but, yeah, it's not like we were advocating for, like, you know, these godlike figures. But there's nothing wrong with having, like, a leader of the revolution, like, loved by the people.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, picture the way that we named an entire state and our entire capital city after George Washington. It's like we don't talk about the cult of personality around George Washington. He was an admired figure in our history, and it's the same shit here. What, are people not allowed to have heroes?
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, and like having what was he saying as far as oh, I forgot.
It's Jin time.
It is.
Let's continue on with this guy, because I have a feeling he's gonna say some more entertaining stuff.
That's why pinning your ideals all onto one man like Stalin or onto a small group of individuals like the Vanguard Party is foolish. It's completely foolish, and it's exactly what's got us into this problem in the first place.
Okay.
Dictatorships only ever produce dictatorships. They never can produce anything else. So then what could possibly be an alternative? Like I said before, I'm not about the problems. I'm about, say it with me, the solutions. So a solution would be, like I said before, a mass line. Preferably a decentralized mass line.
Oh, here we
I
go.
believe that is the best.
A decentralized mass line. So somehow, all of the workers, left, right, and center, liberals, conservatives, weirdo centrists, anarchists, they're all going to come together and push for the overthrow of capitalism. Even conservatives. I mean,
Yeah. People always joke about like, oh, after the revolution, everybody's just gonna sing "Kumbaya" and like stuff like that, and that, yeah, that's annoying to hear, but like, you just can't expect that this spontaneous mass line to just grow. I mean, you can wait until the conditions of society get that bad that everybody agrees that capitalism sucks, but by that point, it'll probably be too late.
yeah.
You know, I mean, we need to be pushing for something as soon as possible, with especially with like climate change and everything. So yeah, you can't just expect this spontaneous line to just like grow and like lead to the revolution.
Yeah, we can't wait for unanimous support from the working class because we understand that vast swaths of the working class is going to be bogged down by the oppressive nature of capitalism. They'll either be too busy to work or too busy to care about politics or too tired. A lot of people feel disengaged and disenfranchised by the current system, especially, people of color. And so, to expect everybody to sort of lock hands and sing Kumbaya and go down the street, and protest against the government in a mass line is idealist to a great extent.
Yeah, and like a decentralized mass line is kind of like we talked about earlier. It's an oxymoron. Like,
yeah.
It's just like misuse of like what was meant by like a mass line.
And like, what if half of the mass doesn't want a socialist revolution? So I mean, what happens to your mass line then? How'd you even get it in the first place? It's decentralized.
Then
so
you
I
have to like just like give up your anarchist revolution. Be like, oh, I guess enough people want capitalism back.
yeah.
That's democracy. Enough people want it, so like we'll just give it back to them. There's gonna have to be some type of coercion because there's gonna be a lot of people that are probably gonna think that way in the beginning.
Shit, guys, we took a vote and it turns out 51% of us want capitalism back. So revolution's canceled. It's over.
Method that we have to be able to subvert capitalism by using itself against itself. Okay, now if you want a little bit more in depth into this, please check out my video up here. And yeah, hopefully that'll give you a little bit more information.
Alright, so in the next time we'll check out his video, How the Mass Line Kills Capitalism. I'm very interested to see this. But yeah, any closing remarks?
Oh, what did he end with there?
Capitalism by using itself as, with me, the solutions. So a solution would be, like I said before, a mass line, preferably a decentralized mass line, as I believe that is the best method that we have to be able to subvert capitalism by using itself against itself.
Like anarchism.
Now, if you want a little bit more in depth into this, please check out my video up here. And hopefully that'll give you a little bit more information. I believe that a Trojan horse strategy, whereas we subvert capitalism from the inside, is the best course of action, whereas I believe a Vanguard party creates nothing but more dictatorships.
Yeah, so this is what we talked about a little bit earlier, but yeah, that's pretty much like anarcho-syndicalism then. I mean, which is different than anarcho-communism. I mean, it can be used as a tactic to achieve it. I guess I see that. But, like, I mean, we talked about some of the problems earlier. I mean, you're going to have these competing factories that are, like, not, like, centralized, and they're going to have different interests and stuff like that. That was a problem in the USSR. I mean, like, and to have no, like, cohesive glue binding them together, you might, see, like, capitalism restoration or, like, what is it, like just like kind of owning that particular territory, a breaking up of like society, like, just like making a different state.
Because I mean, like, from a realistic standpoint, like, let's say you have a worker co-op and everything goes right, and somehow that co-op becomes like one of the wealthiest companies ever. Well, then all the workers in that co-op will just make themselves into bourgeoisie. They will just, probably expand their businesses, and they will decide to make themselves like the majority shareholders in this new corporation.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with using co-ops. I mean, they even had that like in the Soviet Union in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
A small part of their industry was like co-ops. It's something like you can use, but it's to have your whole like economy based on like these co-ops producing everything to like fight imperialism. Yeah, it's kind of idealistic.
And to think that they will be able to fight capitalism from the inside using like worker co-ops, I have a feeling that's where he's gonna go with it.
Yeah.
Like, that's not gonna work out because as a co-op, you have certain responsibilities to your workers, and the capitalists don't give a shit about their workers, and so they can work them as long and as hard as they want. And barring any kind of labor regulations, they'd be able to outcompete any kind of co-op, because it turns out capitalists don't have ethics and they're willing
Yeah.
to work their people to death. And if they really have qualms, they would move overseas to a sweatshop and they can work little children to death. So I
Yeah.
mean, you can't use the higher ground and ethics and stuff to fight capitalism from
Mhm.
within.
I would
And
like. Oh, sorry. Go
I was just gonna finish. Like, you can't rely on consumer um, knowledge. Like, if you're trying to sell your good and you're from a co-op, well, consumers might decide, hey, I'm gonna buy that product. But if you can't successfully sell your product to people in the same way that like a capitalist has to sell his product, well, then you're not going to make any kind of money. You're not going to really make an impact.
I think like one of the biggest parts of this is like you got to recognize that we're like in the imperial core. You know what I mean? So like
Yeah.
we can have, say somehow all the workers decided, that they wanted to take over the factories.
Mm-hmm.
And if you did that, honestly, I think that would imply that you would need a massive trade union of some sort.
Yeah.
So I wonder what he has to say about that. I'm surprised he doesn't talk about it more because that would be the most effective way to subvert capitalism from the inside is having a massive union.
Yeah.
But even if you did that, the capitalists, I mean, they're using like sweatshop labor and all kinds of stuff overseas,
Mm-hmm.
and they can easily just stop, getting stuff sent to your factory,
Yeah.
like the materials that you need that had to be like dug out of the ground. I mean, you would have to essentially take over the government as well and like fill those positions so you
Yeah.
can like have society still function. And in the age of like advanced imperialism, like that's even more necessary now, like the more that complicated like trade and stuff like that has gotten.
Yeah. I mean, it's just there's a whole like can of worms that you open when you want decentralized workers' power. That like our approach, the Marxist-Leninist approach, just kind of circumvents. You don't have to worry about you don't have to worry about all this bullshit in a Marxist-Leninist system. Uh, here workers see state power and capitalism is no more. We don't have to worry about like it infiltrating back in and weird shit like that. But anyway, that was this video. Lenin is wrong. Stay tuned for our next video, I guess, where he's talking about mass lines and how mass lines work.